Welcome, friends. Detective Purbright here. Let's dive into tonight's mystery.
It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday service, until the Reverend was found dead in his chair, and at his feet a baby no one remembered being born, a child who didn't cry, a cradle that didn't belong, and a town that looked the other way for 60 years. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Is it raining where you are? Are the windows closed, or do they creak when the wind sighs against the glass? Let's begin. There was, at first glance, nothing especially troubling about the early service at St. Botolph's Church that quiet Sunday morning. The organ wheezed out the final hymn with its usual hint of apology. The verger nodded through the final blessing, and Miss Felicity Humble applied her third layer of lilac-scented hand lotion during the curate's prayer for municipal unity. It was, in every respect, a perfectly forgettable gathering, until, of course, the vestry door refused to open, not jammed, not locked, just stubborn like a sulking child. Mr. Simpkins, the church warden, a man of unshakable optimism and limited muscle tone, jiggled the knob with increasing determination. From within, there came no reply. He tapped politely, then rapped less politely, then called through the wood, "Reverend Peever, if you please." Nothing. Only then did Miss Humble, now trailing the scent of crushed lavender and mild panic, alert Mrs. Bledlow, the Sunday flower arranger, whose reaction to most problems was to fetch a hatpin and assume command. It was she who fetched the caretaker. It was the caretaker, Mr. Fudge, who forced the door, and it was everyone, absolutely everyone, who then recoiled. There, collapsed backwards in the vestry chair like a broken puppet, sat Reverend Horace Peever, mouth open, eyes fixed on the ceiling's flaking fresco of the Ascension, and arms hanging limp by his sides. Dead, clearly. But that was not the part that made the air collapse from the room. At his feet, nestled neatly in the wicker cradle used for parish donation envelopes, lay a blood-soaked bundle of linen, and inside it, unmistakably, an infant. Or what had once been. It's been born," whispered Mrs. Bledlow, crossing herself despite being firmly Anglican, but not by him. The police station in Flaxborough, a stern red brick edifice that still smelt faintly of boiled ink, was unaccustomed to multiple telephone calls before breakfast, but that morning the lines rang like bells in a wedding belfry. "They found a baby," said one voice. "A dead baby." No, insisted another. "The Reverend was trying to adopt it, illegally." "It's a ritual," said the man who ran the second-hand shop. "Satanic. They use babies, you know. Small ones, easier to post." By 9:15, the town had taken to calling it the corpse that gave birth. By 10 o'clock, a firm statement from the diocesan press office had ruled out anything involving birth, Satanism, or active clergy. And by 10:45, Inspector Purbright arrived at St. Botolph's with a grey trilby, a thermos of weak tea, and the gentle expression of a man who expected very little from the world, and was rarely disappointed. He entered the vestry quietly. It had been cleared of onlookers. The Reverend's body had been removed, leaving behind only a faint dent in the cushion and a strange reddish stain on the hymnal table. But the cradle had not been moved. Inside it, Inspector Purbright noted, was indeed a child, or had been, now more of a small, cold echo of one, wrapped neatly, unmarked, eyes closed, no signs of trauma, no umbilical cord, no signs, frankly, of recent birth, and certainly none from Reverend Peever. Purbright crouched. "You've caused quite a fuss," he murmured. There was something peculiar about the way the linen had been tucked. Not panicked, not maternal, precise, as if for display. He stood, adjusted his tie, and stepped into the nave, where a gaggle of churchgoers hovered near the font, bristling with unspoken theories. Sister Constance, who ran the alms collection, leaned toward him. "They say he kept a journal, Inspector. A secret one. He wrote things. Dark things." Purbright smiled politely. "Did he?" She nodded with a shiver. "Last week he stopped shaking hands. Said he couldn't risk transferring anything." Purbright nodded, thanked her, and made a mental note to retrieve the journal. Behind him, Miss Humble whispered to Mrs. Bledlow, "But how did the baby get there?" That door was locked from the inside, to which Mrs. Bledlow replied, not unreasonably, "Well, dear, perhaps it locked it." Back at the station, Constable Love pressed a photograph onto Purbright's desk. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "post-mortem report just came in." Purbright blinked. "Already?" "They fast-tracked it. Apparently—" He hesitated. "Apparently the baby wasn't just dead, sir. It was preserved. Embalmed, actually." Purbright looked at the image. He did not blink. "Then we must ask," he said quietly, "who would go to such lengths? And why leave it here?" He looked again at the cradle. "And above all," he added, "why now?" Inspector Purbright did not immediately return to the vestry. Instead, he took a slow walk along the cobbled lane behind the church, his hands clasped behind his back, and his gaze lifting every so often to meet the dull grey sky that hung, as always, low over Flaxborough. It was not evasion, but digestion, of facts, of impressions, and most of all, of contradictions. The baby had been dead long before it had been found. That much was clear now, thanks to the prompt report from Dr. Fergus Collerby, who had little patience for the sensationalism swirling through the town and had made a point of labeling the body long deceased, deliberately embalmed, and positioned post-mortem. The wording alone, carefully chosen and typed on his grandfather's typewriter, said more than any official statement might have dared. What was less clear, of course, was how it had ended up nestled at the dead Reverend Peever's feet like some infernal offering. Purbright turned this over as he walked. A staged act, perhaps. Symbolic? A message? But to whom and why now? The Reverend was not what one might call controversial. If anything, his sermons were noted chiefly for their brevity and fondness for weak anecdotes about the unreliability of electric kettles. He rarely travelled beyond the town limits, read old gardening catalogues instead of newspapers, and once wept publicly during a discussion on the proposed closure of the village post office. Not, on the surface, a man likely to find himself in proximity to a mummified infant. And yet, here they were. He was halfway back to the station when Constable Love caught up with him, pink-faced and determined. "Sir," he puffed, "I've taken the liberty, only a small one, of questioning the cleaner at the vicarage. Mrs. Tipton. You'd asked about Peever's journal, remember?" Purbright nodded, his pace unchanging. "She swears she's seen it. Blue leather, little brass clasp. Said she dusted it every Tuesday. But today, it's gone." "Gone?" "Not mislaid. Removed." She was quite specific. "Said the surface where it sat had a square of dust around it." "Thank you, love," Purbright said calmly. "And did Mrs. Tipton mention anyone unusual visiting the vicarage this week?" "Only that he had a caller 3 days ago. Unannounced. Young man. She didn't see the face. Said he wore one of those long canvas coats students like, army surplus type." "Did she hear voices?" "She said she heard one voice. Raised." "Not the Reverend's." Purbright nodded, tapping a finger to his lips. They walked the rest of the way in silence. By late afternoon, the town had moved past horror into the more familiar terrain of casual theory. The Flaxborough Gazette had dispatched young Leonard Mullet to stand in front of the church with a notepad and vague instructions to capture the mood. Mullet, who had failed to pass his driving test 4 times and once wrote a 400-word article about a hedgehog sighting, approached the task with nervy reverence, asking pensioners whether they believed in ghosts and jotting down their answers phonetically. Inside the police station, Purbright sat in the interview room with a different sort of informant. Councillor Herbert Stillingfleet, resplendent in an overcoat too large for his frame and a waistcoat far too tight, had arrived without appointment. "It's only that I think," he said, leaning forward, "you ought to be aware of certain past difficulties." Purbright looked up from his notepad. "Regarding Reverend Peever?" "Indeed. Now, I'm not saying he was unstable, far from it, but a sensitive soul, and not, I fear, untouched by tragedy." Purbright allowed the silence to draw the shape of a question. "Well, you know about his wife, don't you?" the councillor said, lowering his voice. "Madeline. Died some years ago. Nasty business, miscarriage, stillborn. It affected him deeply." "I see. And it's whispered," the councillor added with relish, "that the child was kept, that there were delays in burial." Purbright raised a brow. "Delays? Wouldn't sign the paperwork, held onto the body for nearly 3 days. Terribly sad, of course, but macabre. Was this ever formally noted?" "Oh no, the bishop stepped in." "Quiet word, you understand?" "I do," said Purbright. He paused. "And the child's body, would there be a record of its burial?" "Well, you'd think so." Later, in the vestry, Purbright stood before the parish register. It was open on the desk beside the hymnal cupboard, its pages yellowed and curling slightly at the edges. He turned them slowly, eyes scanning. There it was. Madeline Peever, née Kersey, interred 14th April, 1959. And just above that, hastily squeezed in and crossed through, a single entry in a different hand. Child of H&M Peever, stillborn, interment cancelled. He leaned closer. The date was smudged, but the handwriting, he'd seen it before. Tight, upright, deliberate. He made a note to compare it to the Reverend's known correspondence. That evening the town held its breath for some sort of official statement. None came. Instead, the mystery thickened as Mrs. Grote, who ran the lending library, reported that someone had checked out 4 books on embalming, all in the last 10 days. She had noted the surname. Wickham. "A Mrs. Wickham?" Love asked her over the telephone. "No, dear," she replied. "Mr. Wickham, Alwyn Wickham, lives up toward the Crescent, lives alone, smells faintly of burnt toast and despondency." This, of course, was the same Alwyn Wickham who had once been sacked from the cooperative funeral parlor for mislabeling ashes, and who now worked as a part-time lamplighter. When questioned, he claimed to have borrowed the books for research into Egyptian funerary customs. A hobby. "Coincidence," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Morbidly fascinating, isn't it?" Purbright did not disagree, but he also did not dismiss. That night, the post-mortem report on Reverend Peever arrived in a sealed envelope. Cause of death, cardiac arrest, brought on by acute stress. Time of death, estimated between 6 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. Discovery of the body, 7:20 a.m. Window of opportunity, just under 90 minutes. And most damning of all, a note found crumpled in his pocket, too blood-stained to read in full, but partially legible. "Forgive me. Not born of me, but mine all the same. Please do not." The rest was smudged into pink pulp. Purbright closed the folder. Outside, the lamps of Flaxborough flickered into life. One by one, each a small glowing witness to a town that preferred its mysteries tidy and its deaths mundane. This one was neither. And somewhere, not very far from the church or the station, or even from his own quiet thoughts, someone was waiting, not nervously, not frantically, but patiently, as if they had always known this would happen, and as if they were prepared for what must happen next. The following morning arrived with a drizzle so persistent and so apathetic it seemed less weather and more atmospheric indifference, the kind of rain Flaxborough wore like a cardigan. Damp, familiar, and not quite worth commenting on, Inspector Purbright, however, was already dry and seated in his office, his desk arranged with the neat minimalism of a man who disliked losing things, particularly thoughts. Before him lay 2 documents, the post-mortem on Reverend Peever and a file on Alwyn Wickham, recently reissued by Sergeant Malley, who had annotated the margin with "known to collect embalming jars off eBay, possible enthusiast or lunatic." Purbright read that phrase 3 times, smiled very slightly, and folded the file shut. He was not ready for Wickham. Not yet. Oddness was not guilt. Not in Flaxborough, at any rate, where eccentricity was more common than punctual buses. Instead, he requested the church keys from Constable Love and returned alone to St. Botolph's. The vestry smelled of polish, mildew, and absence. The cradle had been removed. So had the hymnals. Only the shape of the Reverend's chair remained, a half-circle of dust around where it had stood. Purbright crossed to the lectern and examined the parish guest book. It was rarely used, mostly by school children and anxious bell ringers from neighboring counties, but one entry, dated 4 days earlier, stood out. A sharp, angular signature, F.R. Delphine. Underneath, in an elegant antique hand, "To remember in silence that which was once ours." Purbright closed the book slowly, as if it might say something else if given time. Delphine. He'd heard the name before, recently, and not from the church. At precisely 11:02, Mrs. Emmeline Tubb, who ran Flaxborough's only antiques and bric-a-brac shop of any disrepute, informed Constable Love that she had, in fact, spoken to a Delphine just 3 days earlier. "He came in looking for mourning jewellery," she sniffed. "Jet beads, hair locket brooches, that sort of thing. Victorian stuff. Said he was researching grief rituals. Didn't buy a thing, mind you. Just stared at his reflection in a convex mirror for nearly 20 minutes. Had the look of a man waiting to be forgiven. And his first name? Fenton, she said triumphantly. Or Felton, something soft and old-fashioned. Would you recognize him again? I'd recognize his coat. Black, waxed, long, smelled of tobacco and candle wax. Love thanked her and reported back. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had obtained confirmation. A Fenton R. Delphine had rented a room at the Queen's Arms Inn for 1 night only. Tuesday. He had paid in cash. No luggage, no requests. He left before dawn. He said he couldn't sleep near churches, the landlady recalled, folding tea towels with quiet disapproval. Said the bells made his teeth ache. Not that we have bells at the Queen's Arms. I told him that, but he looked at me like I'd said something tragic. She paused. He had a photograph, too, black and white, folded at the corners. He left it on the side table. I still have it. She produced it from a tea tin. A child, barely a toddler, swaddled in heavy lace, seated in a pushchair with brass wheels. Beside the child, a woman's gloved hand, just visible, reaching in from the edge of the frame. Nothing else. No background, no writing, no date. Purbright took the photograph and thanked her. That evening, he called on Dr. Calabi, who was spooning broth into a jar marked Wednesday and muttering about insufficient coroner budgets. I've thought about your question, Calabi said, not looking up. About the preservation of the child, it was done professionally. No doubt, injected, drained, sealed. The kind of work you'd only see from a trained embalmer, or someone who had access to old textbooks and fewer scruples. So not something Reverend Peever could have managed. God, no, he could barely manage the photocopier. And would you say the preservation concealed the age? Calabi finally looked up. Ah, that's the interesting bit, you see. I've estimated the child died at least 10 years ago, maybe 12, which means someone's been keeping it, refrigerated or boxed. Possibly both, like a terrible secret that didn't know where else to go. When Purbright returned to the station, Sergeant Malley was waiting with a furrowed brow and a piece of pink notepaper. "Anonymous message," she said, "came through the letterbox an hour ago." It read, "Inspector, ask about the photograph taken at the Spring Fair in 1959. There's a reason it was never displayed. There was no signature." Purbright sat down and removed the black and white photograph from his coat pocket. The child, the glove, Spring Fair, 1959. He pulled the town archive from the file drawer and spent the next hour leafing through brittle newsletters and commemorative pamphlets. Then, in a creased program for the 1959 floral parade, he found it, a list of winning entries from the photography competition. Best in Show, Mother and Child, by H. Peever. But there was no image. The adjacent pages were intact. Only this one was torn, removed cleanly, as if with a blade. By now, dusk had crept in and was pressing its forehead against the windows. Purbright, his tea gone cold beside him, made one final call. To Mrs. Winifred Swale, retired midwife and former district nurse, who had delivered more of Flaxborough's citizens than the local registrar ever bothered to count. She answered on the fourth ring. "Inspector," I said, "I wondered when you'd be calling. Did you know the Peevers?" "Oh, we all did. Poor Madeline, not built for childbearing, bless her. Fragile hips, fragile nerves. I attended her miscarriage myself." "Do you remember the date?" "I do. April 12th. She went into labor at the Spring Fair, in the church hall. It was the prize draw that did it. She heard they'd picked her raffle number and she stood up too fast." "I see. Sad case, but not straightforward." "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, her voice tightening, "that the child she lost was not the one she was seen with the week before." Purbright sat back. "Excuse me?" "She used to bring it to the baker's, wrapped tight, never cried, never wriggled. She said it was peaceful. And the moment she lost that one, we never saw the other again." By midnight, Purbright had assembled a string of facts, each quiet on its own, each whispering something different when placed together. A child, embalmed over a decade ago. A reverend, dead with guilt inked in his coat. A photograph missing from public record. And now, a silent parade of memories that no one had dared name for 13 years. Someone had preserved a child. Someone had waited 13 years to return it. And someone, perhaps more than one, had believed this would never come to light. But light, like guilt, always finds the softest places to enter. And Purbright, patient and still, was already holding the match. He turned the photograph face down and circled the date, April 12th, 1959. Then he wrote two more words beneath it. "Ask Delphine." The telephone rang at precisely 6:52 the next morning, a time Inspector Purbright had come to associate with milk deliveries, insomniac complaints, and, on one memorable occasion, a counsellor reporting a suspiciously symmetrical molehill. But this morning's call was from the Queen's Arms Inn. "Inspector," said the landlady, her voice taut and oddly breathless. "He's back." Purbright was already tying his tie. "Delphine?" "Yes. Arrived 20 minutes ago. Asked for the same room. I said it had a plumbing fault, which it doesn't, but I thought you might appreciate a few minutes' head start. You have my thanks, Mrs. Featherstone." "Not at all. I have my instincts." By 7:09, the inspector stood once again in the softly creaking hallway of the Queen's Arms, his coat shedding the morning's drizzle in polite, rhythmic taps. Room 7's door was closed. He knocked gently. There was a pause, the sound of movement inside, and then the door opened. The man who answered was not quite what one might expect of a figure haunting antique shops and church guest books. He was young, 35 at most, with dark, careful eyes and a pallor that suggested long days indoors and longer nights with uncomfortable thoughts. "Yes?" he asked. "Mr. Delphine," A nod. Inspector Purbright, Flaxborough Police. Another nod. Then, you're here about the baby. Purbright inclined his head slightly. May I come in? Delphine stepped aside. The room was sparsely appointed. Single bed, chair, suitcase still unopened on the floor. The only item out of place was a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, resting on the nightstand. Would you like tea? Delphine asked, already turning toward the kettle. No, thank you. I'd prefer candor. Delphine exhaled through his nose. Not quite a sigh. I didn't kill him, he said. Purbright took the chair. Reverend Peever. Delphine nodded. Though I admit, I meant to confront him. I just never got the chance. About what? Delphine crossed to the window, parted the curtain and stared out at the wet high street. I was adopted. Grew up in Woking. Quiet house, good people. I never asked much. But when I turned 21, they gave me a folder. It had the name Peever written in biro. Nothing else. Just the name and a photograph. A child in lace? Yes. And a gloved hand? Yes. He turned back, face pale but composed. I found out my mother died during childbirth. There was no record of burial. No record of me being born. Just a blank. I searched for years, trying to make the pieces fit. And then I found a mention of Reverend Peever in a church newsletter from 1959, a photograph contest. Mother and child. But the image had been removed. You believe that child was you? I believe, Delphine said slowly, that Reverend Peever and his wife lost a child, and that in their grief they did something terrible. What precisely? They took another. Purbright watched him closely. You think you were stolen? Delphine gave a humorless smile. Number I think I was preserved. He walked to the nightstand, untied the parcel, and handed Purbright a photograph. It was the same child, but this time the frame was wider, the full pushchair, the background clearly visible. The church hall bunting from the spring fair, and next to the pushchair, Reverend Peever himself, smiling. Only the child, curiously, was unsmiling, unmoving, and oddly stiff. I don't know who the child was, Delphine said, but I don't think it was alive. Later that morning, Purbright returned to the church with the photograph and a thought growing cold and distinct in the back of his mind. The vicarage was still sealed, though a constable now stood politely at the garden gate, nodding at sparrows and occasionally at passers-by. Inside, the rooms were ordered and quiet, almost too much so, the quiet of someone who needed noise removed to think. In the study, Purbright found the Reverend's personal filing cabinet. The key, curiously, was left hanging from the lock. Inside were the usual sermons, tax letters, and pamphlets on boiler maintenance. But beneath a pile of diocesan correspondence, there it was. A blue leather journal, clasp undone, the first few pages neatly dated in a precise hand. The entries were typical. Worries about declining attendance, the biscuit budget, a lengthy rumination on whether carol services had become too jazzy. But midway through, the tone changed. April 14th, 1959. Madeline does not sleep. She holds it in her arms all night. I cannot bear to take it from her. The skin has begun to change. She calls it Fenton. April 15th, 1959. The child is too quiet. I said this to her. She laughed, said it was peace. I dared not ask what she had done with the other. April 18th, 1959. I fear she swapped them. The one who died was not ours. Or perhaps it was. What have we done? What have we kept? The final entry was dated 2 days before the Reverend's death. He came to the church, the one from the photograph. I thought he was a ghost. He looked at the cradle and said, "That wasn't me." Then he left. Purbright closed the book and sat still for a very long time. At the station, Constable Love had located an old funeral notice from 1959. "Sir," he said, pushing it forward, "there was a woman named Maureen Delphine who died in childbirth that April. She'd come up from Cambridge. No family. Baby was declared stillborn, but—" He flipped the page. "The body was never formally recorded as interred." "And the father?" "Unknown. Hospital left the box blank." Purbright considered this. "So 2 mothers lost children that April," he said, "and only 1 infant was seen alive after." By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Malley intercepted a curious visitor in the station lobby. Mrs. Tipton, the vicarage cleaner. "I found something," she said, pressing a small handkerchief-wrapped object into Malley's palm. It was a silver locket. Inside, a lock of hair and the words, "To Fenton, our peace in silence." "Where was this?" Purbright asked when it was brought to him. "Wedged behind the laundry cupboard. I was cleaning like you said, and it dropped out." "Have you ever heard of Mrs. Peever referring to Fenton before?" "Only in her final year," Mrs. Tipton replied. "She used to stand at the back of the garden in the dark, talking to no one, saying, 'Fenton's cold,' or 'Don't take him from me.' I thought it was grief talking." Purbright nodded slowly. "Perhaps it was," he murmured. "Or perhaps it was something worse." That evening he invited Delphine to the station. They sat once again in the small, neutral interview room. The locket lay between them. Delphine stared at it for a long time. "It's not proof," he said. "No," Purbright agreed, "but it's a start. I still don't know who I am." Purbright regarded him carefully. "Does anyone?" he asked. "Truly?" Delphine gave a slow smile. "Number, I suppose not." He stood. "Will you be arresting anyone?" Purbright shook his head. "No. Crime, Mr. Delphine. Not any more. Just echoes. And perhaps poor choices made by people who could not bear the silence left behind by grief." Delphine picked up the locket, nodded his thanks, and left. When the door closed, Purbright finally allowed his shoulders to sink. The town would talk, of course. They always did. But not of murder. Not this time. This was something else. Something older than crime, and sadder than truth. Inspector Purbright did not sleep that night, though he went through the motions of preparing for it, changing into pajamas, brewing tea he did not drink, and lying in bed with his spectacles still on. The locket rested on his nightstand, the silver catching the moonlight in quiet flashes, like the blink of some small and forgotten eye. By morning, he had reached one simple conclusion. Something had still been concealed, not by Reverend Peever, but by someone who had survived them all. At 8:15 a.m., Purbright stood at the door of the Flaxborough mortuary. It was a squat, undecorated structure beside the railway embankment, and its only staff, Dr. Colloby's assistant, Miss Ives, was notable for 2 things: her extraordinary ability to smoke indoors without being seen, and her memory, which was near photographic when it came to death. "I need a favor," he said as she opened the door. She narrowed her eyes. "If it involves stairs or poetry readings, no. It involves the 1959 mortuary register." Her eyebrows lifted. "Now that I can do." She led him past a row of labeled drawers, most unoccupied, and down into the archive cellar, a place that smelled strongly of old disinfectant and responsibility. It took her 5 minutes to locate the book. Thick, leather-bound, and absurdly heavy, she carried it like a baby. With some reverence, she set it on the counter. "Here we are," she said, flipping to April. April 14th, Madeline Peever, stillbirth. April 15th, Maureen Delphine, death in childbirth. "Note," said Miss Ives, tapping the page with her painted nail. "Only 1 infant ever listed. The Peever child, but—" She flipped to the next page and pointed. "In the margin. See that? Delphine infant, transfer to private storage, per diocesan request. Purbright stared at it. Private storage. She leaned in. Sometimes when there's dispute or no clear burial party, the body is retained. It happened a lot back then. Poor mothers with no family, or clergy unsure how to proceed. And where would that storage have been? She shrugged. Back then. The old crypt beneath St. Botolph's. Purbright closed the book and stood very still. Then someone, he said softly, retrieved it. St. Botolph's crypt had not been used in years. It was not locked so much as forgotten, its key stored in a drawer labeled, "For when it smells." By mid-morning, Purbright and Constable Love descended the narrow steps beneath the church vestry, torches in hand, shoes echoing damply on stone. The air was colder here, but not entirely lifeless. The crypt was mostly empty save for a few rotted pews, a crate of unclaimed hymnals, and one unlabeled wooden chest. It was not large. It was not locked, and it was empty. Love looked at Purbright. "You think the child came from here?" "I think," said Purbright, kneeling. It never left. Inside, faint streaks of dust had been disturbed. Something had been carefully lifted out. Recently. Someone, Purbright said, standing, was waiting until all but one were dead. The next clue came not from record-keeping, but from rumor. Mrs. Bledlow, armed with a sponge and a flair for gossip, stopped by the station to report something curiously unsettling about her neighbor's brother. "Alwyn Wickham," she said with theatrical breathlessness, "has not lit the lamps on North Crescent since Monday, and he never misses a rotation. Loves it. Talks to the lamps." "And you find this suspicious?" Sergeant Malley asked without looking up. "I find it unhealthy. Also, I saw him carrying something large and rectangular wrapped in a blanket into the old tool shed behind the community allotments." "Yesterday?" "Last night, under moonlight, like some Dickensian spectre." Malley relayed this to Purbright, who did not roll his eyes, though Love did discreetly. "Let's visit him," Purbright said simply. Wickham's cottage stood at the edge of Flaxborough's less confident end, the sort of street where postboxes leaned slightly and cats outnumbered visible tenants. Wickham answered the door in his dressing gown, hair wild, eyes wide. "I've done nothing wrong," he said at once. Purbright raised his eyebrows. "That remains to be seen." They stepped inside. The living room was crowded with books, all on preservation, mortuary science, Egyptian rituals, and a surprising number of pamphlets on Victorian mourning customs. "I'm an enthusiast," Wickham said quickly. "Academic interest." Purbright examined one cover. "Cradle to Crypt, a theological history of infant death." "Where were you Sunday morning?" he asked. "Home," Wickham replied. "Alone. Did you attend the church service?" "No." "Did you enter the crypt at any time this past week?" Silence. Purbright waited. Then, in a voice half defeated, Wickham whispered, "She asked me to help." "Who?" "Mrs. Peever." Purbright's head tilted. "Mrs. Peever died 11 years ago." "I know, but before she did, she gave me a key." Back at the station, Wickham told the full tale. "I met her through a reading group," he said, hands folded nervously. "She never talked much, but one night, after everyone left, she showed me a photograph, a baby in a pushchair, and she asked me, 'Do you think memory can rot?' I didn't understand at the time, but she said she had kept something and needed to keep it. Longer. She gave me a key to the crypt, asked me to maintain the child." "And you did?" I thought it was already dead, a preserved body. But then I saw it, in that cradle, Sunday morning. Who placed it there? I don't know. But someone used the key. When Wickham led them to the tool shed, the discovery was immediate. Inside, in a sealed wooden box lined with waxed cloth and insulation, were several old, dried roses, a folded photograph of Madeline Peever, and beneath it, An empty silk blanket, the same kind seen in the 1959 photograph. Purbright knelt and touched the fabric. Someone preserved the memory, he said, until it became too heavy to carry. Wickham nodded. I think she believed if she kept the child from decaying, then maybe the pain wouldn't either. That night, Purbright returned to the photograph one last time. He stared at the child's expressionless face, the artificial stillness, the performance of peace. And then he wrote in his notebook, the baby was never meant to be seen, but someone had to see it to end the illusion. Who had placed the child at Peever's feet? Not Delphine, not Wickham, but someone who had known about the swap. Someone who had known where the body was hidden. Someone who had waited until grief had rotted into guilt. The town had forgotten them. The town always did. But one woman had not, and her name had not yet appeared in this story. Not once. Until now. Inspector Purbright had long believed that the quietest places in Flaxborough were where truth most often hid. Not behind locked drawers or whispered gossip, but in silences, the kind that settled between sentences or lingered too long after someone had spoken a name. And there was one name, he now realized, that had not been spoken at all. Miss Edna Mowbray. She had been Madeline Peever's closest friend, or more precisely, her only friend. A stalwart presence at the church's flower rota, a sharp-eyed observer of hymnal misprints, and the unofficial guardian of what the town called ladylike decorum, Edna had quietly outlived nearly everyone she once chastised. But her absence since the incident, no opinions, no visits to the vicarage, no appearances at the co-op till Q, was becoming louder by the day. By mid-morning, Purbright stood outside her narrow brick cottage, 3 chimneys tall and as proud as its owner. A stone cherub, now cracked, watched him from the garden wall. Its expression was rather like Edna's, vaguely disapproving, perpetually alert. He knocked once. No answer. Twice. The curtain twitched. A third knock, and the door opened a fraction. Inspector. Her voice was unchanged, crisp as a chalk snap. Miss Mowbray, he said, inclining his head. May I come in? I suppose you'd better, she said with a sigh, as though hospitality were an affliction. The front parlour was as he remembered, pristine lace on every flat surface, vases of fake daffodils and a faint smell of lemon polish overlaying something older. Not dust, memory, perhaps. He took the offered seat. She did not. I imagine you're here about the cradle, she said, and the poor child. Yes, said Purbright, and about a number of things that no longer fit neatly in the record books. She stared at him, then slowly sat opposite. You've read the journal, I presume, she said. Horace's? I have. And the mortuary ledger? Also that. Then you know what happened. I know what's suggested, he said gently, but not what's true. She folded her hands, still gloved though the house was warm. It was never a plan, she said quietly. Never a scheme or plot. It was despair, Inspector, the kind that blurs the lines. Tell me, she exhaled, slowly, as though releasing something held for far too long. Madeline miscarried in the vestry. You know that. She'd barely made it to the fair. She was carrying the child wrapped in that ridiculous lace, showing it to anyone who'd ask. But it wasn't moving. I knew something was wrong. I said so. She smiled and told me he was tired. She paused. The baby had died the night before. She couldn't accept it. And the switch? I don't know how it began, she said. Only that on the same day, another girl, Maureen Delphine, arrived from Cambridge. Alone, already in labour. They took her to the hall briefly, but there was no medical care. The child didn't make it. But Maureen did. Edna shook her head. Not for long. She collapsed on the grass behind the marquee. Died of blood loss. She rubbed her gloved fingers together. There were only a handful of us who knew. Horace, the old warden, and myself. We kept quiet. Too much shame, too much confusion. And the bodies. The Peever child was quietly buried, a fake stone placed in the churchyard. But Maureen's child, he was beautiful, breathing, healthy, no name, no claim. So Madeline kept him. No, Edna said bitterly. She took him. Horace tried to reason with her, but something had broken. She said it was God's correction, that the child had been returned to her. She named him Fenton, and she smiled again. Purbright leaned forward. But that child, the living one, was sent away. Edna hesitated. Yes, she said. After 3 months, Madeline's condition worsened. She couldn't sleep. She talked to both children, one real, one dead. She thought they were twins. And the living child. I took him, she whispered. I arranged the adoption, quietly, legally, just barely. Sent him far. Somewhere he might forget Flaxborough entirely. The Peevers signed the papers, but they never forgave me. And the preserved child? Madeline kept him, she said, hidden in the crypt. She visited every week, changed the wrappings, sang to him. And when she died, I sealed the crypt. I thought that was the end. But Horace, he began to write. He began to think it wasn't right to let it end with silence. And then last week, I found him in the vestry, dead, with the cradle set before him. Purbright watched her closely. You placed the child there. She nodded once. It was his. Not in blood, but in sin. He allowed it. He wrote sermons over the body of a stranger's son. You could have come forward. I was waiting, she said, waiting for the boy to return. Fenton. Yes, she said. The real Fenton, the child I helped remove, the man who came last week. Purbright nodded. He knows now, Edna said. He knows what we did. He may hate me for it, I don't care. But he needed to see what grief becomes when it's never let go. She stood. And now, Inspector, if it's all the same, I should like to go to the church. For confession? She gave a small, sad smile. Number for silence. Later that day, Constable Love found Purbright in his office, staring at the locket. She confessed then? Love asked. Not in the usual sense, Purbright said, but yes. Will there be charges? No, said Purbright. Just consequences. Love hesitated. And the boy? Delphine? Purbright looked out the window, where the rain had begun again, gentle this time, like breath on glass. He'll have questions. Many, I imagine, but he'll find his peace eventually. Love nodded. And us? Purbright smiled faintly. We returned to the usual. Garden thefts, rowdy teenagers, and what Mrs. Bledlow insists are satanic pigeons. He picked up his pen. But somewhere between the gossip and the biscuits, Love, there will always be grief like this. Old, wrapped up, never quite buried. He looked down at his notes. And sometimes it comes back. That night, as the town turned in and the gas lamps flickered back to life, courtesy of a newly reinstated Mr. Wickham, Purbright took a slow walk past St. Botolph's. The doors were closed. The crypt was sealed once more. The cradle had been burned, quietly, behind the station, with no announcement. The smoke rose without comment. In the churchyard, 2 graves sat side by side now, one marked, one newly carved. Fenton Peever, born and lost, 1959. Maureen Delphine, remembered at last. Purbright removed his hat. The town would forget again. It always did. But for one more day, the truth had been permitted to breathe, and that, he thought, might be enough. The next morning, Inspector Purbright arrived at the station to find a brown envelope waiting on his desk, unaddressed and without postage. It was, as such things often were in Flaxborough, both anonymous and inconvenient. suggesting a hand that had something to say, but not the decency to admit having said it. He opened it slowly. Inside were 3 items. The first, a torn page from a 1959 diocesan report. A ledger entry, crossed through but still legible, noted the requisition of funeral garments, infant size, for an unnamed burial delayed pending clerical approval. The second, a photograph. The same pushchair again. But this time the image had been marked with red ink. An arrow pointing not at the child, but at the gloved hand. And the third, a single line typed on an old, uneven machine. "You never asked whose glove it was?" Purbright stared at the page for a long moment. He had assumed, as had everyone, that the gloved hand in the original photograph belonged to Reverend Peever. But now, beneath the pressure of this implication, the memory wavered. The angle of the wrist, the slight bend of the knuckle, it looked wrong. And Madeline, he recalled, was known for bare hands. Her fingers were always visible in photographs. Long and elegant, like the notes of a hymn. So then, whose hand? He reached for the photograph again. He had stared at it for days, but now it revealed itself anew. Not in what was shown, but what was carefully not shown. The sleeve, the lace. It wasn't a woman's hand. It was too broad. The wrist too thick beneath the glove. It wasn't Madeline's hand. It was Horace Peever's. By noon, Purbright was once again in the crypt, this time alone. He stood before the now empty wooden chest. It had been used not just for storage, but for ritual. The wax lining, the faint scent of lavender. Someone had maintained this space like a chapel, not a morgue. But there was no trace of a lock. No sign the chest had ever been sealed, which meant the child, the preserved infant, could have been removed by anyone. But only one person, he thought, would know how to pose it like that. With reverence, with meaning, as if it were a sermon. At the town archives, Mrs. Findlay was reluctant to allow access to the older parish correspondence without first discussing the moral implications of digging too deep into the tragedies of decent people. But after a cup of tea and 3 well-placed silences, she relented. Within 30 minutes, Purbright found what he needed. A private letter, dated July 1959, from Reverend Peever to the Bishop of Lindham. "It has been a season of errors, and I find myself increasingly uncertain of the moral position I now occupy. I do not know if the child we buried was ours. I do not know if the child we kept was a mercy or a theft. But I do know this. Edna Mowbray came to us that week not as a friend, but as a decision-maker. She instructed, she arranged. She told us, quite calmly, that silence would be safer for all. I fear she believed it." Purbright folded the letter slowly. So Edna had not merely been a witness. She had directed the cover-up. She had orchestrated the adoption, and quite possibly she had done something else. He closed the folder. That evening, as dusk swept low across the cobbled streets, Purbright returned to Miss Mowbray's cottage. She answered the door without a word and stepped aside as if expecting him. "I've made tea," she said. "There's a slice of seed cake, though it may be stale." Purbright sat in the parlor. The daffodils had been removed. The lace doilies were now bare. On the mantel he saw something new. The photograph, framed. The one with the pushchair. Still unspoken, still unconfirmed. "I received a letter today," he said. "Anonymous. It suggested I'd misidentified the hand in that photograph." Edna sat, smoothing her skirt. "And have you corrected your error?" "I believe I have." "Then you know who placed the child at Horace's feet?" "I believe so." She nodded. "Would you like me to confess?" she asked. Purbright watched her. "No," he said. "I'd like you to explain." She sighed. It was never meant to last this long. The silence, the hiding, but the years. They pass so quickly when you surround yourself with lies. I told myself it was protection. For Madeline, for the child, for the church, but really it was for me. I couldn't stand the idea of losing control of the narrative. And Horace? He was weak, she said, not unkindly. He wanted to tell the truth. I couldn't allow that, so I reminded him of what he'd agreed to, of what we had done. But he grew strange. He began talking of atonement. So you returned the child to him? Yes. Why? To make him understand, to make him remember. The real child was gone, buried somewhere we'd never find. But the preserved one, he had worshipped it. He'd built his sermons over it, shaped his theology around its silence. I thought, perhaps it would kill him, and it did. Purbright said nothing for a long time. You committed no crime, he said finally. Not in the legal sense. But what you've done? She met his gaze. I know. I'll carry it. She smiled faintly. I always intended to. Outside, the street lamps flickered on, one by one, in a slow chain of returning light. Flaxborough had begun as ever to forget. The Gazette was now preoccupied with a reported sighting of a two-headed pigeon behind the Methodist chapel. The butcher had a new assistant with alarming tattoos. Mrs. Bledlow had launched a one-woman campaign against biscuits in church. Life returned. But for those who had touched the cradle, who had buried an unburied memory, something had changed. The church remained locked for another week. The cradle was never mentioned again, and Miss Edna Mowbray, who once never missed a Sunday, was not seen at St. Botolph's for a very long time. She had at last chosen silence of her own. Purbright stood in his office, staring at the photograph one final time. The gloved hand, the child, the smile that never quite reached the eyes. He took the letter, the image, and the diary entries, and sealed them in a brown envelope of his own. On the front, he wrote a name, Fenton R. Delphine, and underneath, for whenever you are ready. Then he placed the envelope in the outgoing post tray and turned back to his desk. There was paperwork to complete, a new constable's exam to mark, a pigeon complaint to process. Life, as it does in Flaxborough, had resumed, but something beneath it, something embalmed in silence, had finally been allowed to breathe. And perhaps that was justice enough. A full week passed before Fenton Delphine returned to Flaxborough. He arrived by the 10:08 train from Lindham, stepping down onto the platform with a battered leather satchel and the unmistakable air of someone carrying more than luggage. His face, though composed, held the distant, alert stillness of a man who had recently begun sorting through the boxes of his own life and had not yet decided what to throw away. Inspector Purbright, having received word from the station master earlier that morning, Flaxborough's unofficial early warning system, was already waiting in his office when Delphine knocked. "You came," Purbright said simply. "I had questions," Delphine replied, "and I received your envelope." He sat without being asked. The locket was already in his hand. "I've looked at this 100 times. I keep thinking, why would someone preserve a child like that? It seems cruel." "Cruelty and grief," said Purbright, "often wear the same face." Delphine turned the locket over once, then set it gently on the desk. "I want to know who he was." Purbright met his gaze. "We believe the child was the biological son of Maureen Delphine, your mother. She died in childbirth, as you know, but the baby was born healthy. For reasons that are still not entirely clear, the child was taken in by the Reverend and Mrs. Peever. Shortly thereafter, their own child died. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps something darker. But the switch was made. The preserved child was not you." Delphine absorbed this in silence. "Then who am I?" "You are the child who lived," said Purbright gently. "Taken away quietly, adopted legally, and raised far from all of this. That boy, the embalmed one, became a symbol, a totem of what was lost. But not you. Delphine looked at the locket again. I spent so many years thinking that I was some sort of ghost, a secret, but I wasn't. I was just removed. Purbright nodded, and now returned. Delphine drew a folded slip of paper from his coat pocket. He placed it beside the locket. I've booked a plot, he said. For him. The real one. Not behind the church or in the crypt. By the river. Quiet place. Purbright allowed himself a rare, small smile. Then let's give him a name. The burial took place 2 days later, quietly, under the wet hush of a willow tree near the far end of the Flaxborough cemetery. No priest presided. No hymns were sung. Just 2 men, a modest plaque, and the faint whistle of wind across the stones. Fenton Peever beloved, if unknown. 1959 to 2025, Delphine spoke only once. I don't know if we shared blood, but you haunted my life. I hope now you can let go. Then he stepped back, placed the locket beneath the headstone, and walked away without looking back. Back at the station, life had stubbornly continued. Constable Love had been dispatched to settle a heated dispute between the greengrocer and a boy who insisted he'd been shorted on plums. Sergeant Malley was still investigating a rash of missing lawn ornaments in the North End, and someone, likely Wickham, had once again inserted passages from embalming manuals into the town library's romance section. But despite the day's familiar absurdities, Purbright's mind remained elsewhere. There was something unfinished, not about the child, not anymore, but about the photograph. He returned to the archive once more, this time seeking the original negative, the one submitted to the parish photography contest in 1959. Mrs. Findlay, annoyed but ultimately obliging, pointed him toward a shoebox marked Flaxborough Spring Fair, contest submissions not displayed. It was there. The uncut roll. Purbright held it to the light. The pushchair image was third from the end, but the frame before it showed something else. Madeline Peever holding her child, alive, laughing, and in the background, a figure stepping into the frame, Miss Edna Mowbray, wearing gloves. So then, 2 children had existed at once. The switch may have come after the photograph, not before. But if that were true, Purbright returned to the vestry. He stood at the place where Reverend Peever had been found. The position of the cradle, the posture of the body, the final entry in the journal. Please do not what? Reveal, resurrect, or replace? Purbright took out his notebook and made a final list. The preserved child was never buried. The living child was sent away. The switch was concealed for over 60 years, and Edna Mowbray, for all her precision, had kept something hidden still. That evening he visited her once more. She had expected him. I wondered when you'd return, she said. I've been looking again at the photographs. She offered him tea. He declined. You said Madeline miscarried, that she held the preserved child, but the timeline doesn't quite fit. There's evidence she had both children in her care, however briefly. Why would she preserve one and not the other? Edna's smile was sad now, not sharp. Because the preserved one was hers, she said softly, and the living one was not. Purbright didn't move. She lost the baby early, you see, before the fair, but she never told Horace. She couldn't bear it, so she carried on pretending, and when she saw Maureen's child, abandoned, unnamed, unwanted, she took him. Purbright's voice was quiet. So, the child in the pushchair, the living one, was never hers, Edna whispered. But the love was real. And the preserved child. She had it delivered, embalmed, hidden, as if to say, I did have a child. Look, here, proof. It was the only way she could keep both stories alive. Purbright closed his notebook. "And you let her do it?" "I didn't let her," Edna said. "I helped her." The next morning, Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office. The case, as it stood, was closed. No arrests, no autopsies, no trials. But beneath the still surface of town life, he could feel the water stirring. People would talk, in time, but their voices would trail off, because no one wanted to dig too deep into a grave that had already been filled twice. Still, he wrote a final note in the file. The truth, like the child, was passed from hand to hand, preserved, denied, loved, and at last released. Let the past sleep. He closed the file, locked the drawer, and for the first time in weeks, poured himself a full cup of tea. Outside, the gas lamps flickered on again, glowing softly against the dusk. Flaxborough exhaled, and for now at least, the cradle stood empty. The following Sunday, St. Botolph's reopened its doors. The organ, a wheezing contraption that had been forcibly retired during the investigation, resumed its reluctant service under the hands of Miss Durdle, who played as though in protest. A handful of parishioners returned. Not many, but enough to fill the pews with rustling coats and murmured greetings. Enough for it to seem, to the untrained eye, like normalcy. But Inspector Purbright noticed what was missing. No Edna Mowbray, no mention of Reverend Peever during prayers, and most of all, no child noises, no babies fussing, no toddlers squirming. The congregation had grown older overnight, or perhaps it had simply become aware of its own age. After the service, Purbright stood quietly near the vestry door, sipping the polite excuse for tea served in paper cups. He observed the flock. Nods, small smiles, swift departures. Only one person approached. Fenton Delphine. He had returned again, not in anger now, nor confusion, but something else. "May I speak with you?" he asked. Purbright nodded and gestured toward the back garden, where an uneven bench tilted politely in the grass. They sat. "I've been reading about her," Delphine said. "Maureen. My mother." Purbright said nothing. She worked in a bookshop in Cambridge, sang in a chapel choir. She didn't list a father on my records. It just said, "Not recorded." I suppose that used to mean something more than it does now. He looked down at his hands. "I feel like I've been chasing someone else's life." "You have," said Purbright. "But now you've caught up to it. I want to stay." Purbright turned toward him. "In Flaxborough." Delphine nodded. "I've put in a request to take over the bookshop on Grey Street. The owner wants to retire. He said he'd rather sell to someone with quiet hands and no dog. I qualify on both counts." Purbright smiled faintly. "You may find it complex here." Delphine's voice was steady. "I've lived complex already. I'd like to try dull." That afternoon, a letter arrived at the station. Cream paper, black ink. The writing was rigid, exact, and unmistakably Edna's. "Inspector, there is something I omitted. Intentionally, I admit. Not to deceive you, but to delay you. Perhaps selfishly, perhaps out of cowardice. I leave that for your judgment. Before Madeline's death, she gave me a box. She said, 'If I go first, you must carry this.' And I have. For 11 years, I've kept it sealed. But now that the boy has returned, I believe it no longer belongs to me. You'll find it in the church attic, behind the hymn board. The key is under the flower sink. Yours." As always, Edna Mowbray Purbright folded the letter. Then he stood and reached for his coat. The church attic was seldom visited. It had served, over the years, as a sanctuary for broken candle stands, holiday pageant props, and at least 3 retired mannequins, each stored with exaggerated reverence. The light bulb overhead flickered in protest as Purbright climbed the narrow stairs and ducked under the sloped eaves. There, precisely where she had said, stood a chest, wooden, unlocked. Inside was a single envelope marked Fenton and a parcel wrapped in floral cloth, yellowed with time. He opened the envelope. Inside, a letter in Madeline's handwriting. "My dearest child, you will never know me, and perhaps you should not. But if this letter has reached you, then it means Edna has chosen to honor my wish, however belatedly. I do not ask forgiveness. I only ask that you believe this. I held you, I sang to you. I told you stories, though you could not understand them. For 3 months, you were the reason I rose each morning, and though the world may call that theft, I call it motherhood. Brief, broken, but real. I let you go because someone wiser knew I could not keep you and stay whole. But I never stopped loving the sound of your breath as you slept. This parcel holds the blanket I wrapped you in, and a photograph. Not of the one everyone remembers, but of you, the real you, smiling. May your life be yours now, entirely. Reverend Peever." Purbright closed the letter. He did not look at the photograph. That was not his to see. He found Delphine just before closing time at the bookshop. "Inspector," the young man said, surprised. "Didn't expect you." "I have something," Purbright replied. "Something your mother left for you, hidden until now." He handed him the letter, the parcel. Delphine opened neither. He held them as if testing their weight. "Should I read it alone?" "Yes." Purbright turned to go. But Delphine spoke again. "Do you believe people like her, like Edna, do those things out of love?" Purbright paused. "I believe love," he said, "is not always kind. But it's usually honest, even when it's wrong." Delphine nodded. Then he opened the parcel carefully. A pale blanket, faded now, clean, and beneath it, a photograph. He stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled. For the first time since he had arrived in Flaxborough, he smiled. The town moved on. It always did. St. Botolph's returned to its routine. Hymnals cleaned, sermons shortened, biscuits repurchased. The grave by the river became a quiet curiosity. Some claimed they remembered the child. Most did not. But a few brought flowers, always white. Edna Mowbray no longer hosted luncheons or chaired committees. She kept to her garden, refused visitors, but sometimes, late at night, her lamp could be seen glowing behind the curtains. And it was said, by those who paid attention, that she'd taken up writing again. She was never seen at the church, but her silence, for once, no longer felt like absence. As for Purbright, he filed the last of the reports, placed the photograph negative in the sealed archive box, and requested that no further inquiries be made. When Sergeant Malley asked him what the final conclusion had been, he simply replied, 2 children were born. One was buried, the other forgotten. Now they've both been returned. Malley frowned. "And the law?" "The law," Purbright said quietly, "has nothing left to prosecute. The guilty are all ghosts, and ghosts don't sign statements." Malley nodded slowly. "Then we let it rest." Purbright closed the file. "We let it rest." And for the first time in weeks, Flaxborough truly did. Until the next quiet catastrophe arrived, of course, as it always did. It was a curious thing, how the air in Flaxborough could shift with something as simple as a knock on a door. Not a thunderclap, not a scream, not even the mournful wail of the distant foghorn, but a simple, polite knock. That was how it began again. 3 days after the child's final resting, Inspector Purbright was seated at his desk with the 3rd cup of tea that had cooled past usability, reviewing a report on a suspected arson at the cricket pavilion. It had, in fact, been a forgotten sausage roll left too near the electric radiator, when the knock came. It was not hurried, not aggressive, just 3 firm taps, measured, deliberate. He opened the door. A woman stood there, late 40s, perhaps 50, impeccably dressed in navy and grey with gloves she did not remove. Her eyes were steady and dark, the sort of eyes that had seen both disappointment and determined action, and preferred the latter. "Inspector Purbright," she said, with the cool certainty of someone who already knew it was him. "Yes? I believe you knew my mother," she said, "though not, perhaps, well." He blinked. "May I ask your name?" "My name," she said, "is Lydia Delphine." The name was a thud, not of violence, but of something falling into place. She was Maureen Delphine's sister, but more importantly, she was Fenton's only surviving blood relative. They sat in his office. She declined tea, declined small talk, but when she spoke, she did so with crisp clarity. "I had no idea my sister had a child," she said, "until 3 weeks ago. May I ask how you discovered it?" "A letter in my solicitor's safe, left by my father who, in one of his more lucid years, had apparently learned of the boy's birth through someone at the diocesan council. They were childhood friends. He never acted on it, but he documented it." Purbright nodded. "And you came here?" "To confirm," she said, "and to see the grave." He passed her a copy of the photograph. The plaque, the letter Madeline Peever had written. She studied them all with an unchanging expression. "I have no interest in disrupting his life," she said. "But I do have an interest in the truth. There are still things missing." Purbright gestured for her to continue. "The date of the birth, the body that was embalmed, the fact that Edna Mowbray continued visiting the crypt until the Reverend's death." Purbright frowned. "What of it?" She hesitated. "I believe there may have been a second burial." The claim was absurd. And yet, as was the way in Flaxborough, absurdity had a habit of peeling back to reveal something quietly awful. Purbright returned to the cemetery records. The council clerk, Mr. Higgsley, had developed a system of filing that no one but himself understood. It involved color-coded pins, astrological references, and a ledger that had once been used to catalogue livestock. But among the nonsense, a pattern emerged. On April 16, 1959, the day after Maureen Delphine's death, 2 burial plots were recorded as opened. One matched the existing record for Fenton Peever. The other was anonymous. Plot 47B. Fee waived, no stone ordered. Purbright rubbed his chin. "Who handled this one?" Higgsley squinted. "Let's see. The old verger. Mr. Dello. Dead now, of course. But he made notations. Look here. Little triangle in the corner. Meant silent burial. Meaning? No service. No witness. No record beyond the ledger. Who authorized it?" Higgsley pointed at the faded signature. "It wasn't Horace Peever. It was Edna Mowbray." The next day, with a quiet escort and the consent of the council, Inspector Purbright supervised the opening of Plot 47B. The grave was shallow. The coffin, if it could be called that, was a child's toy chest, varnished wood, hinged without inscription. When it was opened, even the grave diggers went still. Inside, wrapped in muslin and lace, was the body of a second child. Not embalmed, not preserved, just laid to rest. Gently, tenderly. A nameplate had been tucked into the lining. Maureen's boy, nothing more. He summoned Edna. She arrived at the station in her best coat. No fuss, no protest. "I'd hoped it would never be found," she said. "Why did you bury him there?" Purbright asked. Her voice, for once, was small. "Because the one we kept wasn't him." She looked up. "You see, Inspector, we switched them twice." Purbright's hand stilled over his pen. "Explain." "Madeline's child was born dead. That much you know. But after we took Maureen's boy in, she began to unravel. She'd hold the embalmed one, call him Fenton, and the living one. She began to fear him." "Fear him?" She said he was watching her, judging her, that he would expose her. So what did you do? I took the living child, she said softly. And I buried him. Not murdered. He was already dead, I swear that to you. She closed her eyes. One night I found him in the cot. Still, blue. I don't know how. Cot death, perhaps. But I couldn't tell her. Couldn't let her know, so I laid him to rest. Quietly. And replaced him with the embalmed child. Purbright felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. So the preserved body we found in the vestry was already dead twice over, Edna said. Once by fate, once by obsession. When Lydia Delphine heard the news, she said nothing for a long time. Then, at last, I will pay for a proper stone. She walked with Purbright to the riverside plot. They stood in silence. Is Fenton his name? She asked. Purbright shook his head. No one knows his name, but perhaps it's the one he should have had. A week later, a new stone was erected over plot 47B. Fenton Delphine born in silence. Lost in silence. Now remembered in full. And behind it, in the church, a notice appeared in the bulletin. Let the sins of omission lie with the dead. Let the truth be left now with the living. Purbright never discovered who wrote it, but he did not remove it. Some truths, like bodies, are best laid gently, then left alone. The final chapter of a Flaxborough mystery rarely came with sirens or trials or solemn statements read to assembled press. There were no handcuffs, no speeches in court, no photographs of the inspector shaking hands beneath the Union Jack. Instead, it came with a cupboard being cleared, a record corrected, a name finally spoken without fear. It was raining again. Not heavily, but with the thin, persistent drizzle that Flaxborough wore like a second skin. Inspector Purbright stood just inside the vestry, coat buttoned, hat in hand, watching as the church caretaker, Mr. Fudge, affixed a small brass plaque to the cradle they had once considered burning. It was no longer a cradle, really. Not now. It would sit in the church's side chapel as a memorial, a symbolic place, neither grave nor altar, but something in between. The plaque read, "In memory of the unknown child who was lost and found and lost again. Nitten femoghalv treads, til to tusen og femogtiv." Fenton Delphine had approved the wording. He had, in fact, suggested it. He stood nearby now, speaking quietly with the curate. His posture had changed since those first days. Still quiet, still watchful, but no longer coiled. He had found in Flaxborough not answers, not fully, but contours. Edges he could press against, names he could remember without burning, and names he could finally leave behind. Inspector Purbright returned to his office as the last of the light faded from the sky. It was nearing 7, and the smell of rain on red brick drifted through the slightly ajar window. He removed a folder from his cabinet, thick, dog-eared, tied shut with string. It had begun as child unknown. It had passed through infant found in vestry, cradle case, preservation incident, and finally settled under the stark but oddly biblical heading, the corpse who gave birth. He removed the documents one last time. Photographs, letters, ledgers, the bishop's notes, Edna's confession, Lydia's burial request, Madeline's letter to a son she could not keep, and began placing them in archival envelopes, for future hands. Not for justice, but for understanding. There was a knock at the door. It was Sergeant Malley. "They're done with the gravestone," she said. "Which one?" "Both. Lydia had the older one polished too. She said the boys should match." Purbright smiled. "She's right." Malley lingered. "There's something odd," she added. "Only one thing?" he asked mildly. "At the edge of the graveyard. Plot 3D, there's been a disturbance. Groundskeeper thinks someone was digging there last night. Purbright set down the envelope. Another body? No, she said. Nothing in the ground. But someone left this. She handed over a sheet of paper. It was a hymnal page. From Abide With Me. A single line circled in pencil. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. He visited Edna Mowbray the next day. She answered the door slowly. Her skin had grown thinner, her eyes clouded, but her voice was still hers. You've come about the grave, she said. You knew? I suspected, she said. I left it there. Why? Because the boy was never really buried. Not truly. Not while I still carried the memory. He waited. And I thought, she continued, if I returned the hymn, you might understand. Understand what? That it's over. She looked at him then, and her voice cracked for the first time. I'm ready, Inspector. To be quiet. The church held a final private service. No one was required to attend. But many came. Not for scandal, not even for memory, but for silence. Lydia Delphine read the blessing. Fenton laid a single white rose on each grave. Purbright did not speak. Not then. But afterward, as the bells rang out softly over the town, he stood with Fenton beneath the willow and said the words he had been carrying. You were never forgotten. Only misplaced. Fenton nodded once. That's enough, I think. Yes, Purbright said. It is. Back at the station, the folder was sealed. The label affixed, case closed, 1959 to 2025. Flaxborough Police. No prosecution, no guilty party alive to stand. But still, resolution, or something near it. Constable Love knocked and entered. Sir, there's a new matter. Already? A Mrs. Henshaw says her garden gnome's been moved again. Purbright chuckled. Then let's attend to it. He placed the sealed folder into the cabinet and locked it with a quiet, final click. As he left the station, he passed the notice board, now adorned with spring fair posters, a missing cat appeal, and one weather-stained clipping from the Flaxborough Gazette. Cradle mystery laid to rest. Town reflects on long-buried tragedy. Below it, someone had scrawled in biro, we never knew his name. But we remember him now. Purbright stepped into the evening. He did not look back. The end.